Kelly and Alan. I'm from Monash University, and together with my colleagues, Professor Andrea Reupert, also from Monash University, and Professor Lindsay Oates from the University of Melbourne, we've edited a book called Building Better Schools Through Evidence-Based Policy and Practice. This is a book of adaptable policy for teachers and school leaders. And thanks for joining me today. To give you a little bit of an overview about the book and what it entails, you'll find 38 ready-to-use policies that are completely free under Creative Commons. As you'll hear, this is absolutely thanks to wonderful sponsors that have made this book freely available for everybody to use and circulate. So we're hoping that it will be disseminated widely. The book has involved 70 scholars contributing to it, and they represent countries all around the world. And there's also been a broad representation of peer reviewers who have also contributed to each policy. As is standard practice in academic writing, we often have academic peer review providing feedback and guidance on a particular publication. But in this particular case, we used academic peer reviewers, but we also included representations of people you'd find every day within a school: parents, students, teachers, and in one case we've even got a paediatrician that was kind enough to offer her time. So 38 policies, you'll find a broad representation of topics, and some you'll hear about today. So you'll hear about student and teacher wellbeing, load reduction theory, excellence in Indigenous education, applying science of teaching and learning in the classroom, and we'll hear about transgender and non-binary students and the best practices with working with these specific populations. As I mentioned before, scholars that have contributed to the book have come from all around the world with a big representation in Australia. The book contains guidelines on how the policies within the book can be adapted and implemented. In fact, we've got a chapter on implementation, and we also have a chapter on how schools can create their own policies and how schools can adapt the policies to their specific setting. Each of the contributors were given a bit of a brief that their policy needed to be broad and applicable to a wide range of schools. And by that I mean schools within different sectors, but also schools that are international and outside Australia as well. So we're hoping that the book will be applicable to schools worldwide. The book is new and novel in the way that it provides evidence-based policy from scholars, you'll notice, who have spent a considerable amount of time researching on a particular topic. So not only are they research active, they're also considered to be experts in the particular topic that they are writing on. So we're looking at a really salient and succinct resource that really synthesizes a particular area of research and provides it in a way that's digestible and easy to use by schools. So we hope that today you'll enjoy hearing from our highly esteemed colleagues who will present on their particular policy area. So please enjoy.
Thanks to our sponsors, the Homeless Project, the Black Dog Institute, Psychological Assessment Australia, Communities That Care, Psychologists in Schools Interest Group, and the Belonging Lab, that this book has been made free and available for you to download and use from the link on your screen. So I encourage you to download the book and share it widely. It's a powerful, time-saving resource full of policy that is ready to use and for you to adapt in your own certain circumstances.
So the book that this symposium is based on, Building Better Schools with Evidence-Based Policy, is really about trying to connect research and practice. And as a researcher who works in the area of the use of evidence in policy and in practice, I wanted to share some reflections on the idea of evidence-informed practice. And in particular, I want to highlight 5 features that I think are important for us to remember about evidence-informed practice, because lots of people talk about evidence and using an evidence-based approach, but often without a recognition of the complexities that are involved in evidence-informed practice. The first feature I want to highlight is this idea of integration. Evidence-informed practice is not about research evidence telling practitioners what to do. It's about research evidence being integrated with. It's complementing the professional expertise of practitioners and working them together. The power is in the integration. The power is not in the research evidence in and of itself. A second issue that's really important is that evidence-informed practice needs to be orientated towards educational improvement. Carol Weiss wrote a long time ago that social researchers tend to ask, how can we increase the use of research in policy? Whereas her argument was what they should be asking is, how can we make better decisions, and in what way might research be able to help that? The first one is about increasing the impact of research. The second one is about improvement using research. And it's the latter thinking that we need. So evidence-informed practice needs to be about responding to challenges of practice. A third issue that's really important is that the sort of process of evidence-informed practice, of doing it within schools or systems, is highly skilled. It's a really skilled process. It involves quite sophisticated knowledge and understanding and mindsets as well as skill sets in order to be able to access appropriate research evidence, in order to be able to evaluate it, and then in order to be able to implement it within practice. So it's skilled work. It's also very social. It's a team sport. It's not an individual pursuit. Being able to access research evidence, being able to make sense of it, and then being able to know how to implement it, all needs groups of colleagues coming around and working together to be able to identify evidence, find it, access it, understand it, and then work out how to use it in different contexts of practice. We're talking also about the fact that evidence-informed practice doesn't happen in a vacuum. It needs to be supported. So support is really important. So it depends on role modeling of leaders. It depends on leadership. It depends on supportive cultures, school cultures and system cultures. It also, very importantly, requires on it in terms of resources and time, in terms of infrastructure. All of these features, what I'm trying to do is highlight 5 features of evidence-informed practice that are important. So there's integration, there's improvement, and then there's the fact that it's skilled, it's social, and it requires support. Now, I highlight those because they're all addressed by this new book of Building Better Schools with Evidence-Based Policy. All of the chapters speak to different kinds of improvement challenges and priorities that schools can experience. There's a really strong focus not on research telling schools what to do. It's much more around policies that can be adapted, rewritten, reworked for different contexts. And the need for that to be a collaborative process is emphasised very strongly throughout the book. The chapter that we contributed from the Monash Q project team, which is a research project focused on improving the use of evidence in schools, the chapter on improving research in practice is exactly about that issue of it needing to be recognise it as a skilled process that requires social interaction and that needs support. So altogether, I think one of the real strengths of this book and this symposium is that it's addressing not just the aspiration to be evidence-based, but really some of the realities and nuances of working towards evidence-informed schools and practice within our systems.
Hello, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the sovereignty of the Kaurna people, the First Nations people whose land I live on and work on here in Adelaide, South Australia. I'd also like to acknowledge all of the traditional owners of the lands of the people across Australia. Today, I'm going to talk through our chapter on transgender and non-binary students, staff and family members in schools. I'm Professor Damien Riggs in psychology at Flinders University, and I'm speaking on behalf of myself and my co-author, Dr. Claire Bartholomaeus, and we are the authors of this chapter. So to give a bit of an overview of our chapter and this topic area in general, we know that growing numbers of young people in particular are disclosing that they are trans or non-binary, and people often ask why this is the case. A really obvious answer, I think, is that there's greater awareness. So there is greater representation, including some positive representation of trans and non-binary people in the media. And I think that means that young people have a language now to talk about their experiences. Certainly, as well as working at the university, I also work as a psychotherapist, and I specialise in working with trans and non-binary young people. And many young people say to me that they knew that how other people understood their gender wasn't how they understood their gender, but they didn't have the words to talk about that. So the growing number of young people disclosing that they're trans and non-binary really is a reflection of that growing awareness. Certainly historically in schools there was and has been, and in some places still continues to be, a lack of recognition of gender diversity, very much a focus on cisgender, so people who aren't transgender, so the majority of the population, and no sort of awareness of gender diversity, and that includes in curriculum, in books, in materials, and in some places certainly negative attention to trans and non-binary people. And we know that for trans and non-binary young people in schools, that lack of recognition, that lack of awareness, and most certainly that negative attention leads to marginalisation. It can lead to young people being absent from school, performing poorly at school, disengaging from school in general. So we know that the increased representation, the increased recognition of trans and non-binary people is a really important facet of school life. So in our chapter, we argue for the need for a whole of school approach. And what we mean by that is that everyone in the school environment, including staff, administration, but also families and all young people and the broader community, need to be actively involved in working towards the inclusion of trans and non-binary people. And whether that be students, whether that be parents of students being trans or non-binary, or teachers or other staff. So it requires the school to be proactive, and really the research suggests in general that schools that have the policies in place, enact those policies, that they take the lead in guiding inclusion. They're the schools where young people do the best. The schools where the parents have to advocate, or the young person has to advocate for themselves. Even if the school is trying, that requirement of the family to do that work means that the outcomes are often not as good. So we really need that leadership to take that role that filters through to the whole school, that sets the tone of what inclusion for trans and non-binary people can look like. Really importantly, it doesn't matter who's in the school. We should be trans and non-binary inclusive whether we know there's someone who's trans or non-binary in the school, because we might not know that someone's trans or non-binary. It might be that someone discloses that they are later on, but that really isn't the point. The point is about inclusion. We don't know in the future who the students that we're teaching are going to engage with. Someone could have an intimate partner who's trans, could grow up and have children, and they could be trans or non-binary. We really don't know, but what we want to do is equip students to have that knowledge so that they can be inclusive when they do meet, or maybe have already met, someone who's trans or non-binary. So this has obvious benefits for everyone. It's not that the inclusion of trans or non-binary young people has benefits for just those young people. It certainly has benefits for them, but it also has benefits for everyone who may at some point in their life be engaged with, to support, or have a relationship with someone who's trans or non-binary. So in terms of the specific aspects in our chapter that we really focused on, it's 9 specific areas with a lot of detail in each, which obviously I won't go through. You can read that in the chapter, but just to go through them briefly. The first one is around the philosophy or the ethos of the school. How does it approach inclusion? What does inclusion mean? Is it tokenistic? Is it one-off? Is it all-encompassing as per our whole of school approach? So it really, how the school frames its understanding of inclusion, its understanding of diversity is really important. Then related to that are the policies, procedures and guidelines the school has, and certainly in state schools, some of those already exist. In private schools, they might need to be implemented in a school-by-school basis. But as I said before on the previous slide, the school having them in place and enacting them and enforcing them from the top down is really the best approach for ensuring inclusion. As I said on the previous slide, again, leadership is central to this, and that is about, creating space for staff to undertake training. It's about supporting staff in their understanding, supporting students and families to come to a place of understanding. It really takes leadership to guide this. Point 4 is about record keeping. So that is about how does your school grapple with a young person changing their gender? How easy do you facilitate that process, or is that process difficult? Is that a barrier? The 5th point is around language use, and this is again important for everyone. It's about, does your school divide when groups have to be formed in a class into genders, or do you recognise there's more than 2 genders and dividing by gender can be really marginalising? It's about the language you use in school more broadly to describe sex and gender and sexuality. Is that inclusive of trans and non-binary young people? Point 6 is about resources and training. So that is, what opportunities are there for staff to engage in ongoing development? What opportunities does your school provide for young people to learn? So, a really great example is having books in the library, not off in a sort of area that needs permission to access, but books that feature trans and non-binary characters. And that's across the spectrum, from storybooks for very young children through to young adult fiction. How available are those resources to everyone? Point 7 is about support for the school community. So what resources does the school provide for everyone in the school to come to a place of understanding? It's one ship to have leadership that's very clear around the inclusion of trans and non-binary students, but then how do you support the people in your community, the other families, the friends, the people, the grandparents, anyone who may be incidentally related to the school, to foster that sense of inclusion? Point 8 is about curriculum. So obviously I said before, we need to make sure we have resources in a school library, for example, but then how does that extend into the curriculum? How do we ensure, for example, that our sexuality or our sexual health education is trans and non-binary very inclusive. So it's really important that those resources map across to the curriculum. And the last point is about trans-specific initiatives. So you may be familiar with the sort of concept of gay-straight alliances, but they are sort of quite specific and that language is quite limited. So what might be other ways of thinking about, student-led, with the support of staff, initiatives that are about fostering awareness and inclusion, led by trans or non-binary young people if they seek to do so. So that point 9 is really about recognising the agency of trans and non-binary students to direct their needs, to determine what that sort of support network might look like. Might it be a trans-only space? Might it be a trans and cisgender in combination space? And what role do staff have to play in making that happen? So that was a brief overview of our chapter in the book, Building Better Schools with Evidence-Based Policy. Obviously, the chapter goes into a lot more detail about these 9 points and gives a much more detailed overview of the background to whole-of-school approaches. Thank you very much for your time.
Hello, my name's Andrew Martin. I'm an educational psychologist and researcher in the School of Education at the University of New South Wales. In this presentation, I'll be talking about how to get the optimal balance between explicit instruction and guided discovery learning. I should also say that I share this presentation with my co-author, Associate Professor Paul Evans, who's also in the School of Education at the University of New South Wales. I think it's pretty fair to say that school is difficult. For everyone at some point there's a challenge that needs to be navigated. In terms of the academic curriculum, school is difficult and becomes more difficult as students move from primary school to high school or elementary school to secondary school. And so, for example, there's an escalation in homework, there's an escalation in the frequency and difficulty of assessment, the content to be covered, school subjects tend to get more difficult, deadlines start increasing and colliding. So in all these sorts of ways, there's significant pressure on learners as they progress from one year level to the next. Given these difficulties, it's important for instruction to reduce the burden on learners as they go as much as possible. And so what I'll be explaining in this presentation is getting the right balance between explicit instruction and guided independent learning or guided discovery learning is critical for easing the cognitive burden on learners. Cognitive, instructional and educational psychology have been particularly effective in identifying instructional approaches that are geared to reducing the cognitive load on students. To understand how to reduce the burden on students, it's important to understand where the source of that burden often lies. And a little bit on human memory and the human memory system is important to explain that. In the most basic of terms, the human memory system can be seen as comprising 2 main components. One is working memory and the other is long-term memory. Working memory is the conscious part of cognition where we receive information, we perform tasks, we solve problems, we process information and so on. And it continually does this by retrieving information from long-term memory and applying this information as needed. Importantly, if working memory is overloaded, then there's a real risk that instructional content may not be understood, or it may be confused or misinterpreted. Information may not be sent properly to long-term memory, and so therefore it won't be learnt. Students may make slower progress, and indeed there may be other burdens such as motivational barriers like anxiety. So the aim of instruction is to deliver that instruction and learning tasks in a way that does not unnecessarily burden working memory. Now, here's the kicker. Working memory is extremely limited, so some will say between 15 and 30 seconds that it goes. Some will say about as long as a phone number, and it can't hold much more. This presents an enormous challenge to educators because it's this conscious aspect and this limitation of the cognitive structure that needs to be accommodated when you're teaching new material. You can't overload kids in the early stages of learning. So this is where long-term memory comes to the rescue, because long-term memory has vast capacity, has vast storage. And so the aim of education is to build up the body of long-term memory that students can continually access, retrieve and apply as needed. So we might think of working memory and long-term memory in terms of a desk you'd work at. And so on the top of the desk is a limited surface area. And so it's got space for a book, a laptop, a cup of coffee, a pen, and that's about it. The bulk of information that you'll be drawing on will be in the drawers that are under the desk, the filing cabinets that are around the desk. And so those drawers and filing cabinets are what we might think of as the long-term memory, and that surface area might be how we might think of working memory. And so you need a fairly clean and efficient working memory because there's only limited space on the top of the desk. But we can have lots of information at our fingertips in our long-term memory or in the filing cabinet and the drawers. How to actually get that balance and how to do that has often been a point of debate. And so, for example, in broadest of terms, there's more constructivist and postmodernist approaches to instruction. And then at the other end of the continuum has been positioned things like positivist and post-positivist or explicit and structured, highly structured approaches to instruction. What we argue under load reduction instruction is that these two, often having been set up as a dichotomy, it's actually a false dichotomy. The quality learning experiences draws on both, but it's the order in which they happen that's absolutely key, and that's where load reduction instruction comes into the frame. So load reduction instruction is based on the idea that first, learners are novices in the early stages of learning, and therefore the aim of instruction in the early phase is to reduce the load on working memory. And you do that by presenting material in sequenced, structured, bite-sized ways. Then the reality of our memory system is such that some repetition, rehearsal, drill and practice are needed, as is very high quality improvement oriented feedback, and these together build fluency and automaticity. When the learner is fluent in the skill and knowledge that they've needed to learn and acquire, that's then when they're ready for more guided independent or guided discovery learning approaches. So that being the case, load reduction instruction comprises 5 key principles. The first is reducing the difficulty of instruction during initial phases of learning as appropriate to the learner's prior knowledge or prior learning. The second is instructional support and scaffolding as students are taking this information and skill on board. The third is providing ample opportunities for structured practice. The fourth is providing instructional feedback feed forward, so improvement oriented feedback. And the fifth, once students have the skill and knowledge, they're fluent and or more automatic, that's when guided independent application and guided discovery learning is appropriate. Our research has shown that load reduction instruction is significantly associated with high levels of achievement, motivation, engagement, class participation and school enjoyment. And so we propose that load reduction instruction is a way to ease the burden, the cognitive burden on learners as they go about their learning. This is conducted in 5 concrete pedagogical principles, and that when this happens, students are in a much better place to learn, achieve, and indeed be more motivated and enjoy what they do. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone, my name is Rebecca Collie, and I'm a Scientia Associate Professor of Educational Psychology in the School of Education at UNSW Sydney. And today I'm going to be talking about policy to promote teacher wellbeing. Now, the importance of student wellbeing has been known for quite some time, but nowadays schools are increasingly becoming aware of the importance of teacher wellbeing. And so teacher wellbeing refers to positive and effective functioning at work. And when teachers are experiencing wellbeing, they are energized and they are engaged at work. So promoting teacher wellbeing is a worthy and important aim in itself. And teacher wellbeing is linked with a range of positive psychological, physical and occupational outcomes. Now, teacher wellbeing also has many positive carry-on effects for students and schools. And so it's an important thing to focus on. Now, knowing that, what can schools do to foster wellbeing? And so in this brief talk, I'll focus on some broad strategies that schools can use to promote teacher wellbeing. And the first of these strategies is autonomy supportive leadership. And autonomy supportive leadership involves practices that support teachers' empowerment and self-initiation at work. And we know from several studies that autonomy supportive leadership is linked with positive teacher wellbeing. And so what does this involve? Well, autonomy supportive leadership involves school leaders, and that's not just the principal, but any leader within a school, engaging in a range of behaviours. And they include things like seeking input from teaching staff on school level and department level decision making. And so that means giving teachers opportunities for ownership over important decisions. It also involves really listening to teachers' perspectives and taking time to take those perspectives on board. It also involves providing a rationale for new work tasks that need to be done. And so, for example, this might be explaining to teachers why something is being asked of them rather than just telling them to do it. And then autonomy supportive leadership practices also involve offering choice and options about work and related tasks whenever possible or feasible. And so that's the first strategy. The second strategy involves efforts to promote a positive school climate. Now, we know from research that a positive school climate, which involves a supportive and caring culture within a school, is important for teacher wellbeing, and it's also important for student wellbeing. And so knowing that, what can schools do to foster a positive climate? Well, efforts to do that can involve a range of strategies, and I'm going to focus on a few here. The first that I'm going to talk about is embedding social and emotional learning curriculum across the school to promote healthy social and emotional development among students, but also a healthy working conditions for teachers. And social and emotional learning curriculum also helps to provide a shared language and shared norms about positive social interactions within the school. And this is important for students' development, but also teacher wellbeing. The second strategy under promoting a positive school climate is providing teachers with time. Teachers need time to build positive relationships with students, and they also need time in order to develop effective collaborative practices with their colleagues. Now, time is a commodity that is very hard to come by in schools, but teachers really do need it. They need it to develop positive relationships with students and colleagues, and these positive relationships are a core component of a positive school climate. The third strategy involves job supports. And these are, resources or practices that support and help teachers to feel and be effective at their work. And so a growing body of research has highlighted the importance of job supports, which are also known as job resources, for helping teachers to thrive at work. And job supports can also help teachers to manage some of the more complex aspects of the job. So in fact, job supports can even help to buffer or mitigate some of the detrimental effects that job demands like challenging student behaviour and high workloads can have on teacher wellbeing. And there are many possible job supports for teachers. And in fact, both of the overarching strategies I discussed above were job supports, but I'm going to focus on a few other concrete supports here. And so the first is reducing extraneous workload. Because teachers' workloads are so high, they're high because teaching is a complex profession, but there's also been some increases in accountability and compliance over the past decade, which have added to teachers' workloads. And so reducing workload whenever possible is a really important step that schools can take to support teacher wellbeing. And some ideas for this include having meeting-free weeks or giving teachers relief from yard supervision duties when it is a busy time of year. Time to recharge is another important job support. And this is really important, not just for teachers, but also for school leaders. And so one strategy for this is having an agreement about times that are free from email. So for example, one school may agree that there are no emails sent from leadership between a Friday evening and 4 p.m. on a Sunday afternoon. So teachers know that is their time to switch off and recharge. And then targeted professional learning. So allowing teachers the opportunity to select the areas of professional learning that they'd like to focus on. And also providing opportunities and time for professional learning communities so that teachers can engage in ongoing learning that is directly related to their needs and also embedded within their teaching context. That's really important. And so taken together, I've discussed some broad strategies that schools can use to better support teacher wellbeing. And importantly, these strategies are likely also going to support student wellbeing as well, because we know that when teachers are faring well, this helps them to forge stronger connections with their students, and it also helps them to provide better support for their students. Thanks very much for your attention.
My name is Cam Brooks and I'm a researcher at the University of Queensland, and I also have a background as a classroom teacher. When we're talking feedback policy, at the very heart of this, we really should be talking about ways that we can make feedback most effective for learning and also at the same time sustainable for teachers. Teachers often report about the workload required to implement feedback in the classroom. So what does the research say? Well, the research says that teachers regularly giving much feedback in the classroom and also after learning, often when they're typically at home. Yet at the same time, students are reporting that they rarely receive feedback. So how can this be? Well, we need to consider the variables of feedback. And typically, students report that feedback might be given too late in the learning period, or the focus might be separate from the focus of the assessment, or that they might not understand the feedback, or perhaps they might feel overwhelmed and there's too much and they don't know where to start. So as teachers, what we need to bear in mind is that the best designed feedback really is ineffective if the students ultimately don't act on it. What this tells us is that we need to shift our thinking about feedback. We need to shift away from traditional transmissive models where the expert gives feedback to the student. We need to shift towards more student-centered approaches where we're concerned and we're thinking about the right conditions to be put in place for the students to be able to receive the feedback and to be able to interpret that feedback and act upon it. So once we've shifted our thinking, what we then need to do, and this is even before we're getting into the classroom, is to review our practice. And we would say that we're teaching at our best when we have a rich understanding of what our students have to know and do at the end. That's what our feedback is often aimed to do, to try and promote that improvement towards the end. But as teachers, we need to know that from the start, and we use a process called backward mapping to do that. And in schools, this is best done in collaboration, where teachers are sitting down with their teams, unpacking summative assessment and asking the question, what's the key thinking our students have to know and do? And this then feeds into feedback opportunities, because we can then think as teaching teams, well, what could be the best learning opportunities, the best practice that I can put in place in my classroom to give students the best chance to be successful at this for when it gets to the summative assessment? And also, what could be a good question that I could ask to elicit feedback opportunities along the way? Something else that we need to work on at a whole school level, and something that we shouldn't take lightly, is the building of a learning culture. Feedback is very much tied in with relationships. It's the way that we perceive others can influence, and the person who's in a sense giving us the feedback, they can have a strong influence on the ways that we receive and interpret that feedback. So in the classroom, we really need to build a culture where students value learning and improvement over achievement, where they're willing to have a go and perhaps a repeated attempt. And any errors are actually welcomed as seen as opportunities for learning, something as a positive rather than as a negative. And to do this, we really need to balance challenge and support. We need to harness challenge, really leverage off students' curiosity so that they can have a go, but we also need to bring in supportive processes so that they'll feel safe to lean in. Within the classroom, we often talk about the feedback cycle, and we say feedback is effective when students can answer or find answers to the three questions of where am I going, how am I going, and what is my next step to improve. We call this in our feedback policy, the first one, where am I going, clarifying success. And in schools we have many ways to do this, such as giving students statements about what we're learning today, what we're looking for, goals, success criteria, sharing of marking guides, and so on. These are all great, but something that we need to bear in mind is that these are almost leaning back to those traditional transmissive approaches where we're giving this information to the students. In student-centered approaches, we take this to the next step and we try and make the students active. So rather than giving them the success criteria, for example, we can co-construct success criteria with students. And we typically do this by giving them a stronger and a weaker example, and asking them which one they think is more effective and why. And it's through this discussion of why that we co-construct the success criteria. And we refer to this as building a nose for quality with our students. And this really sets them up for self-regulation and to help answer the next two questions. So the next question, how am I going? In the policy, we refer to this as checking in on progress. And within our toolkit as teachers, we draw on formative assessment. And formative assessment is a process and it's not a product. And this is really important. It's a process of us forming decisions about the next steps for learning. And this can be done formally or informally in the classroom with what we see and what we hear. And lastly, in terms of promoting improvement, well, here, that's where we answer the next question, what is my next step, or how can I improve? And something that we refer to in the policy here is about using peers. Peers can be seen as a second resource in the classroom. And the great thing about peer feedback is once students have looked at someone else's work, how do they then come back and see their own work? Do they see it differently? Can they perhaps see ways where they can value add and improve their own work? So in short, by situating feedback within learning And shifting from a traditional transmissive approach to a student-centred approach, we can make feedback effective for students and sustainable for teachers. Thanks.
Hi everyone, my name's Pam Snow. I'm a Professor of Cognitive Psychology in the School of Education at La Trobe University in Bendigo. My presentation today is about the role of evidence-based practice in school decision making at a policy and classroom practice level. You'd all be aware, I'm sure, that education as a sector has a history of being prone to adopting fads and fashions on a bit of a whim, jumping on new ideas on the basis of their face appeal, sometimes their slick marketing, and sometimes questionable sales pitches that use sciencey sounding words and make a lot of reference to the research without people necessarily getting access to that research. Now, this has been frustrating for school leaders, teachers, parents and students, and it's often meant that students have actually been the subject of poorly conducted informal experiments over the years. There's been low fidelity implementation in many cases, even where good ideas have been applied, and they haven't always been applied without drift from well thought out and tested models. Now, in part has reflected a zeitgeist of the view that teachers are the experts in their classroom and their expertise and judgment shouldn't be questioned because they're professionals. But as we've seen occurring in recent decades in other professions, the notion of being a professional really means working within a highly constrained form of accountability. And this is something that we've particularly seen in clinical and public health over recent years. We've seen a seismic shift in the last 20 years away from practitioner opinion, habit and experience to an expectation that diagnostic and management decisions are informed by and transparently driven by the best available scientific evidence. Now, we don't think it's okay for health professionals now to do their own thing, or as some would say, to choose their own adventure. And pleasingly, we've seen that thinking become more evident in education in the last couple of decades. When we talk about evidence-based practice, importantly, we're referring to evidence from the peer-reviewed literature, the scientific literature. We're not talking about evidence that a particular teacher might have gleaned from assessing a class of students, or that a principal might have gleaned from analysing some in-house data on demographic characteristics of their students. That is all data, but it's not what, and it needs to be considered alongside rigorous scientific evidence derived from academic research. But when we're talking about evidence-based practice, we're talking about consulting, critiquing and translating evidence from methodologically robust research that has gone through the filter of peer review. Now, peer review is not a fail-safe mechanism. It's a quality assurance mechanism that is about the best that we've got for ensuring the quality of the rigour of research and the ethical merit of research that's published in the academic literature. Importantly, as the evidence changes over time, as it does in all fields of scientific endeavour, then it's important that clinical practice, educational practice also changes to reflect those shifts in and refinements in the knowledge. It's important also, when we're talking about evidence-based practice, to be considering the level of the evidence. One methodologically weak paper in a low-ranked journal is not going to stand alongside a meta-analysis of methodologically robust papers that have gone through a careful filtering process by researchers applying rigorous criteria and then synthesizing the data from a number of studies. So the level of evidence is a really important construct to keep in mind when we're talking about evidence-based practice. Not just finding a paper somewhere that supports an idea that we want to run with in our school. That's not being faithful to the notion of what evidence-based practice actually means. Sometimes evidence-based practice means having to let go of certain ideas and practices that might have good face appeal, might be quite habitual, might be quite comfortable within a school, but they don't necessarily measure up when scrutinised scientifically, or it may be that they're just not the best available approach approach, given research that has been published on other more recently developed ways of thinking or ways of approaching instruction and instructional support. So it is important when we look at adopting new approaches that we're equally focusing on how we can shift out approaches that we're going to move on because we've got something that's more fit for purpose based on our critique of the research evidence. Exposure to evidence-based instruction is important for all students, but it's particularly important for some groups of students. And here I would single out students from disadvantaged backgrounds who don't have quite the level of social and cultural capital to support them when they start school and across the school years, students with any kind of neurodisability, and students who display concomitant learning and behaviour difficulties. And that's not necessarily in the context of a diagnosed neurodisability, but there are some students who do have learning and behaviour problems, and their risk of early disengagement from school is very high. So evidence-based practice is not a panacea, it's not a silver bullet. What it does do is support scientist practitioner thinking. It helps staff to pose clear questions, seek the best available evidence, and identify how to translate that into effective school-based practice.
Hello everyone, I'm Diane Valla-Broderick, and along with my colleague Dr. Tan Chuan Chin, I'd like to share with you some of our themes around developing policies for student wellbeing interventions and how to improve their implementation. So you might ask, why are schools well positioned to deliver wellbeing interventions? Well, we feel there are a number of reasons for this, in particular because schools are accessed by so many young people, and if you deliver wellbeing interventions in a school environment, it means that the majority of young people have the opportunity to receive the wellbeing intervention and subsequently to learn about wellbeing and to develop wellbeing strategies and a toolkit that they can use both now and in their future. It also contributes to a common language and understanding of wellbeing that can be shared in that school community and reinforced so that they can encourage one another to enhance their wellbeing and behave in a way that's consistent with promoting wellbeing. It also helps to erode the social stigma that's often associated with mental health services by being delivered in a universal setting, and that means that everybody receives it and no one is singled out having a need to have mental health sort of assistance. And it's a very cost-effective way of delivering wellbeing interventions to a large number of students, and it can potentially reduce the demand on public health services. So there's a growing demand for schools to be involved in the delivery of wellbeing interventions, and we know that that is already occurring in many schools who are doing it really, really well, and they may serve as great exemplars for those schools seeking to deliver wellbeing interventions, perhaps in a more deliberate way for the very first time. And so we hope to provide educational leaders and school communities who are looking to deliver wellbeing interventions with some ideas about the key sort of principles and themes that need to be addressed when looking to deliver an effective wellbeing intervention. And that can be turned into policies that help to make this whole process a lot more transparent and to adopt a step-by-step process that's more likely to lead to positive outcomes. So let me share with you now some of the ideas that Tan Chuan and myself had around this. So it's really important that schools support the whole wellbeing intervention process, and in particular school leadership are on board, that they've got committed staff and are engaging the broader community to endorse the whole concept of enhancing wellbeing in the school community, and that there is readiness to actually implement the program, not just in terms of a mindset, but in terms of setting it up logistically so that it can succeed. And so there are a number of important steps that are needed along this line, and that is to work as a team to promote wellbeing at school. It shouldn't be the responsibility of any one person, but the whole range of individuals required to be involved and have the opportunity to contribute in a meaningful way. And in particular, of course, the teachers are involved and school leaders need to be encouraging and supportive, but the student contribution shouldn't be neglected, and there should be opportunities for them to be involved in active decision making and be given leadership roles and be involved in wellbeing committees within the school. And this is likely to promote the students being engaged and wanting to access the program. And that's a really important step. It's also important to consult with experts in the field. Delivering a wellbeing initiative within a school is no small task if it's going to be done well and if it's going to be done for the long term. And so it's important to consult with perhaps schools that have already been engaged in this process that can offer some valuable insight, or scholars from university who have got expertise in ensuring that you select a robust and evidence-based program and that you use effective measures that are going to be consistent with the objectives of the program, and that you can interpret the findings effectively, as well as working with community groups, particularly child and youth service groups that might have valuable insights about the young person's experience that needs to be considered in this whole process. It's important to provide support and training for both the staff and the students to ensure that they feel competent to be able to deliver the program as intended, and for students to have the opportunity to learn skills around leadership and wellbeing. So providing that professional development and opportunity for skill development and leadership is critical. And it's important to make the wellbeing interventions visible to the school community and to students in particular through a number of different mediums, but in particular through modelling, staff in particular modelling the key wellbeing components that their students are being taught at school. And this can send a very clear and effective message that the program is well supported within the school community, but to not just talk about wellbeing in the classroom, but to act it in all areas of school life, extracurricular activities. It's also important to inform parents and stakeholders what's being taught in the classroom and in the school more broadly, so that they can reinforce it at home, so that there's this whole culture that's being developed around the promotion of wellbeing. And so policies really need to address these important elements and to allocate adequate resources to ensure that the wellbeing programs are being delivered effectively, that teachers and the students involved have the appropriate amount of time to be able to prepare and reflect on the wellbeing initiatives that are taking place, that there are needs analyses that are taking place as well to ensure that the intervention aligns with the needs of the students and school community, and that there is a process for being able to evaluate how effective the program is. Is it working? And so to do that, you need robust measures that you can introduce at baseline, and then once again after the program completion, but also to measure process and whether things have gone smoothly in terms of how the program was delivered and how it was received by those involved in the wellbeing program. So receiving feedback about the program. And it's important to understand that this information is really important, because delivering a really effective wellbeing program takes time and often a number of iterations. And so creating policy that's going to collect at that level of information, bring in a number of stakeholders and really think about not just the short term but the long term effects is going to be really powerful. So we hope that these suggestions are helpful, and we wish you all the best in your wellbeing promotion initiatives within your school. And if you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to contact either myself or Tan Chuan on the email addresses provided.
Hi, I'm Larissa Fogden, and I'm a researcher in the Domestic and Family Violence Research Team in the Department of Social Work at the University of Melbourne. My colleague, Professor Kathy Humphreys, and I wrote this policy to guide schools in responding to students living with domestic and family violence. Now, we know a lot about how living with family violence can adversely affect the health and development of children and young people. When we're thinking about educational outcomes, though, exposure to family violence also has the potential to negatively impact things like mathematical, verbal, and reading abilities, as well as levels of school engagement and attendance. But in some good news, children and young people often identify teachers and other education professionals at school as people outside of their families that they might turn to when seeking support for family violence. When children and young people feel supported at school, schools can be protective against the impacts of violence, as well as contribute to building student resilience, self-esteem, and healthy coping skills. But staff within schools can sometimes lack the confidence to know how to appropriately respond to student victim survivors. Lots of staff feel like they know how to identify when a student might be experiencing violence, but are not really sure what to say or do when students disclose, or what the scope of their role in responding should involve and who they should tell next. So the policy that we've written has got a few different parts to it, but it firstly encourages the establishment of a designated family violence response team who'd meet regularly to coordinate the school's responses to both newly and previously identified students living with violence. This team then can also hold the dual role of providing secondary consultation to staff and maintaining links with external support services. It's also really important that training is regularly provided to all school employees and that it's not just limited to identifying the signs of family violence. Training should also cover things like how and where to document concerns and observations within the school's welfare system, what the school's process for responding to disclosures and providing ongoing support might be, how to maintain and uphold confidentiality related to student disclosures and circumstances, and specific issues relating to risk and barriers to support that might be experienced by diverse cohorts of students. It's also a really good idea to set up professional development sessions run by local family violence support services. All of this training should be completed as part of the employee induction process and occur on a regular basis. Students should also be informed at regular intervals at places like maybe school assemblies about the school's confidentiality and information sharing policies so that they know who they can talk to and under what circumstances the information they share with staff might be released to their parent or caregiver, to child protection services, law enforcement, or anyone else. Then, when a student does disclose, they should also be clearly told who the responding staff member will share their disclosure with, and provide them with opportunities to participate in decision-making, obviously as appropriate, related to what will happen next. When students have disclosed, they should also have the opportunity to collaborate with the family violence response team and also, when appropriate, with the non-offending caregiver to create an individual support plan that will allow students to access things like maybe adjustments to class schedules, access to a computer and internet outside of school hours, or additional learning support. These sorts of provisions are particularly important for students who may move into refuge or transitional accommodation. It's also important to plan with the student and the non-offending caregiver, when appropriate, to create a clear safety plan for lots of things like maybe how a student travels to and from school, how to respond if a parent who's perpetrated violence arrives at the school to see the child, or how to respond if a parent who's perpetrated violence contacts the school asking for information. This plan can then be documented and also kept within the student's file so that everyone's on the same page about how to respond in these situations. These are just some of the ways that schools can effectively respond to students living with family violence whilst also maintaining the dignity of students. It's also really important to emphasise that any school policy related to family violence must also sit within a wider whole-of-school response that builds gender equity and respectful attitudes and practices into the overall culture of the school. If you'd like to read more, our policy can be found in Chapter 30 of Building Better Schools with Evidence-Based Policy.
Welcome to Nebraska, the most central of the United States. I'm Beth Dahl with the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, and I'm here today to share with you my policy chapter on data-based assessments of psychological well-being in whole school environments. The premise of my work is quite simple. I believe that the social and academic success of students is stronger when they learn in schools and classrooms that support their psychological well-being and their resilience. There's 4 ways that schools can accomplish this. First, by fostering strong and caring relationships between students and their peers. Second, by fostering sensitive interactions between teachers and their students. Third, by implementing everyday practices to develop student autonomy and self-regulation. And fourth, by infusing moments of joy into every school day. These are ambitious goals, and it's often difficult for teachers and administrators to tell when their efforts to build a resilient school have been successful. And that's why the use of data-based assessments of psychological well-being are so very important. My chapter's policy describes the use of brief measures in which students describe their experiences of these supports in their schools and their classrooms. Results then can be used by the school to inform their school improvement efforts. In an ideal situation, de-identified results can be shared with students because their insights can contribute in important ways to understanding the meaning of the data. And students often have very practical, useful suggestions for what can be done to strengthen the school climate. Ultimately, this is a cost-saving exercise. Data-based monitoring of positive school environments will allow school improvement teams to focus their attention where it is needed most, on those aspects of the school environment that are not yet fully supportive of student resilience and well-being. Planning for school improvement can then become more deliberate and more focused. And when data-based assessments are re-administered periodically, schools can use these as a measure of their progress in creating a resilient school. Prior research tells us that this will pay off in better student attendance, higher student achievement, fewer challenging behaviors, and stronger mental health.
Hello, my name's John Toombaroo, and I'm the Professor and Chair in Health Psychology at Deakin University. I'm pleased to be talking to you today about alcohol and drug policy in schools. When we think about alcohol and drugs, we're talking also about tobacco, and the other drugs refers to illicit drug use. It's important at the outset to say these are some of the most important problems that our society faces. Tobacco kills more people than any other drug. And alcohol is a huge problem for young people. And we know that all of these things can really take them in a direction that's going to be very bad for their education. And it can cause trouble for those people who are trying to manage the school system if there's issues associated with student behaviour or if there are law-breaking behaviours of selling drugs, which can often occur. My co-author in putting together a chapter on this policy area is Dr. Tracy Evans-Witt, who currently works with the Australian Institute of Family Studies. My role is at Deakin University in Australia. Tracy and I have been working for some years at evaluating school alcohol and drug policies, and we've done this through a series of longitudinal studies which have been published and which we refer to in our chapter. What I want to do is just briefly overview what our conclusions were as we completed this chapter. We noted that, firstly, that this is a relatively common behaviour. We know that alcohol, tobacco experimentation is still common. Illicit drug use is more common than we would like, and it's more common in some countries than others. And we do know that there's a popular movement at the moment to try to legalise cannabis in some places, such as the Americas. We'll summarise the harms that these drugs cause, and we emphasise that schools can play a really important role in prevention. The most important thing to say is really conveying the expectation that students won't be involved in these behaviours is critical. So there was a time in Australia where the policies pursued what was described as harm minimisation, and things happened as a result of that were not good for young people. Tracy and I studied and followed up children and really discovered that where the social norms become favourable or tolerant towards alcohol and drug use, it sends a bad message. Children take the message that these things are going to be all right and safe, and so use increases. So in our chapter, we emphasise the importance of an abstinence-oriented policy. We found this has been a game changer in Australia, where more and more parents and schools have moved towards this message for alcohol. And that's had a very positive effect in reducing the experimentation with that drug. And as a follow-on, there's been lower rates of illicit drug use in the school system. And that might seem surprising to you because there's often, I think if you're in schools and you do witness students using alcohol and drugs, you can think to yourself that this is just occurring all over the place. The good news is it's not. And in fact, it is possible to reduce rates considerably. So having expectations and conveying them in your policy is very important. And we describe some of the appropriate ways to do that. That needs to be communicated to parents and to visitors. And so the policy communication is mentioned and we note its importance. Parents play a critical role. It's important to be all on the same page around what happens at home and to convey to parents that they do have rights in Australia to do things such as not to sign consent forms that allow their children to go off to someone else's house and party in a place where alcohol would be provided before the children turned the legal age for purchasing alcohol, which in Australia is 18. Monitoring is actually something that we often neglect. So we're not talking about making children feel like they're under inspection all the time. But we do believe that it is important to make sure if you're going around the playground that there's not evidence that tobacco is being used and that students need to be aware that it's possible for them to confidentially report if they think there are some issues that they want to report on. And so this needs to be made clear that it's going to be a safe environment. And that's the way to have a primary prevention. But what about the children that do experiment? Well, there's every harm is done if the policy does not make clear that the children are not to be thrown out of school. So it's important to provide support and counselling, but not to shy away from dealing with incidents where this occurs. So it's important to take into account safety. Also, at times, depending on the breach, if it does involve a breach in law, then it may be necessary to involve the police. But the first response should be always to communicate what will happen to parents and to students. And if that's done in an environment where abstinence is emphasised and the benefits of that are communicated, there is clear evidence that you will see lower rates of problems in your school. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Lucas Walsh.
And my name's Jo Gleeson.
And we're from the Faculty of Education at Monash University, and we'd like to talk about our chapter on careers policy. The context in which we wrote it was the wider context of the contemporary labour market. It's more fluid and oftentimes precarious. People are likely to change jobs over the course of their career. They're often likely to experience change and fluidity, and so we see international bodies like the OECD talking about a shift into certain forms of knowledge onto skills such as soft skills, communication and so forth, and this idea that learning how to learn is really important as the young person makes their way across the life course.
So careers education has been a part of school curriculum for many years, but probably more so nowadays. It's increased in importance to provide really robust and comprehensive careers education and advice to students while they're still at school. There's a lot more pathways available now, there's a lot more information that's available, and I think the challenges that you've just spoken about make it even more critical for students to be able to connect their secondary school studies with what they're going to do after school, whether that's straight into employment, a traineeship or an apprenticeship, or into some type of study.
So, the question underpinning our thinking in relation to this chapter is careers education within your school aligned and attuned to these wider changes within the labour market?
And I think too, is your careers education approach inclusive of everyone, not just the careers advisor or the careers advisors within the school and students, but includes parents, school community members, but also the teachers as well. It's really important that the teachers understand what's happening in the careers education program and the two are connected.
Something we've seen in our own professional experience It's the idea that careers education exists over there and it's separated from the school environment. Whereas connecting the things that Jo was just talking about and the various actors, parents, etc., as well as the idea that the kinds of skills, dispositions, knowledge that young people require doesn't necessarily just emerge from a careers education. It can be infused throughout school life.
Yeah. Or careers education sometimes gets boiled down to subject selection in Year 10. Or it gets boiled down to, okay, pick a tertiary pathway when you're in Year 12. But more and more, careers education is about starting early, starting as early as grade 6 and Year 7, and supporting students all the way through their secondary school experience to connect, really connect what they're doing with worlds of work out there so that they can, I guess, identify with what their story is when they leave school.
And, you know, there's some research out there too that says that the early in life that the discussions about the future take place, and these can be in primary school, have an effect and an impact on later choices. Now, that's not to say that, you know, a child in grade 4 needs to know what their career is, but even just thinking about the future and imagining what those futures might look like is extremely valuable. So we hope that you find this chapter useful.
Yeah, very much so.
Thanks very much.
Personalised Wellbeing Planning by Professor Lindsay Oades and Associate Professor Aaron Jardine. This policy is aimed at providing guidance for schools to develop personalised wellbeing plans for students. Wellbeing is important in its own right, and it relates to being capable. Wellbeing and academic performance are also related. Personalised wellbeing planning facilitates learning and wellbeing benefits and supports students to achieve academically. Responsibility for wellbeing needs to be shared across the community, not just rely on external professionals or clinical services after problems have already manifested. The goal of personalised wellbeing planning aims to equip students with knowledge and skills about and for their well-being. Personalised wellbeing planning aims to build capabilities around well-being and well-being literacy for students, for staff, and for parents and caregivers. Personalised wellbeing planning is based on 3 key evidence-based principles: personalisation, connection and choice, and evidence-based action planning. With students at the centre, these 3 principles are relevant to the whole school community. Personalised wellbeing plans are tailored to each student's age, ability, their context, and their individual needs. The policy sits above various programs operating within a school and utilises online technology for delivery. Recommended implementation is through a staged approach across several years. A whole of year level approach is recommended as a starting point, with a whole of school approach being considered optimal. Adequate training of staff, parents and students in wellbeing, planning, collaboration and wellbeing literacy is required for the policy's success. Students create their own wellbeing plan in collaboration with a coach. This could be a trained school staff member or an external coach, and this occurs in consultation with parents and caregivers. Students set, they enact, and they monitor their progress towards their own personally chosen wellbeing enhancing goals and activities. Optimally, progress towards wellbeing enhancing activities will be reported with academic and other non-curricular activity. Personalised wellbeing planning supports students to self-regulate their wellbeing actions and their academic actions. This policy can be integrated with existing programs, curriculum, pedagogy and assessment. A policy document template intended for use by schools is included in the chapter. The policy document can be adapted or modified where indicated. Thank you.
Are you a teacher who wants your school to use research and evidence better? Are you maybe a school leader who wants to develop a whole school approach to research engagement? Or are you a system leader that wants to support a network of schools to use research and evidence better? Well, if you're any of those things, a new book chapter from the Monash Q Project team called Using Research Evidence to Improve Practice could be exactly what you need. This book chapter is designed to be easy to access. It's published within an open access book, and so it's free to download, free to share. We hope also that it's easy to adapt, because it's framed in terms of the typical sections of a school policy template, and so you can easily adapt it for use in your context. And we hope it's also easy to understand. It's grounded in the specific steps that research engaged schools take to develop a stronger culture of research use within their improvement efforts. So, and of course, this book is published by the Monash Q Project, which is a 5-year initiative to understand and improve research use in Australian schools. It's grounded in the latest research both in Australia and internationally. What does the book chapter contain? Well, we provide succinct definitions of key terms. So what do we really mean by research evidence as compared with other kinds of evidence? What do we mean by research-informed practice, etc.? So it provides clarification on those key terms. It also helps to really explain why these issues matter. So how does using research evidence connect to the core issues and interests of schools, such as improving teaching and learning, strengthening inclusion, developing staff? And also, the chapter contains specific steps that schools can take to strengthen the use of research evidence to improve practice. So, commitments that a school can make in terms of visions and values. Practices that can be put into place at all levels of school, right across the school in different areas. And also, of course, supports that can be put in place to develop and support a culture of research use within a school. So if you're interested in unleashing not just the power of research evidence, but also its power in combination with professional expertise within your school, then this book chapter is a good place to start. And we'd also encourage you to look at the many other free resources and tools and publications from the Monash Q Project on the Monash Q Project website.
I'm Associate Professor Monica Tilking, and I'm the author of Chapter 31, the policy titled Promoting Educational Equity for Students from Socioeconomically Disadvantaged Backgrounds. We know worldwide that students that face poverty and other forms of socioeconomic disadvantage fare much worse than their peers who come from more advantaged backgrounds. It's a phenomenon that occurs in every country throughout the world. We know that the aim of education is to give young people, children and young people, opportunities to succeed in life, to get a job, and to be able to participate in society more broadly. So it's really important that all schools do whatever they can to ensure that the provision of education in their school is done equitably, to ensure that all students can benefit from education regardless of their family background and how much money they have. So there's simple things that schools can do to make sure that students in their school have access to education in a way that's equitable to their peers. Things like, for one, just recognising to begin with that there may be children and young people in a school that don't have the same access to resources like money and other equipment that's required for education, such as home internet, computers, the right books, etc. And that these kinds of things may disadvantage them and that may cause barriers for them in terms of their engagement and their access to activities and opportunities at school. So when designing curriculum, when creating book lists, when designing excursions, or thinking about creating extracurricular activities, keep this in mind as a school, that not all students and families may be able to afford it. And so there is a policy in place to ensure that for those that cannot afford it, that there is a discreet, respectful and dignified mechanism in place to provide both students and their families with support or with alternatives to make sure that children are not disadvantaged in any way. I said discreet respectful, dignified. Not being able to afford educational expenses or activities can cause quite a lot of shame or stigma for some families and for children. And so it's really important that schools make sure that they understand that and that they are approachable, and they can do so in a discreet and respectful way. And so part of this policy is naming and thinking about, for your own school and your own school community, how best to connect and engage with families that might be facing this situation. The other part of this policy is to think about what kind of outside or external resources are in place that might be able to be available for families to provide them with additional resources and support to ensure that their child can access things like school camps, or have the right uniform or books, or even access to technology. So use this policy regardless of what school you're teaching in. So even highly advantaged schools may have situations where families suddenly face disadvantage. There could be a job loss, mental health issues in the family, or any type of issue that suddenly causes a family to plunge into poverty. And so being aware that this can occur for any family at any time is also really useful for being able to have strategies in place for your school when this does occur, to make sure that students are not stereotyped or excluded or provided with a lesser form of education whilst you're working out how to deal with those issues. So I hope that this policy is useful to schools to think about creative ways to engage with families and to provide an education that is inclusive and equitable and ensures that all students, regardless of economic background, are able to benefit from the opportunities that a good education provides. Thank you. I'm Associate Professor Monica Tilking, and I'm the author of the policy that's titled Establishing Effective School and Community Collaborations to Prevent Student Homelessness. This policy is for schools who are interested in having a policy in place to ensure that they both identify as well as support children and young people who are facing issues around homelessness, housing insecurity, or are at risk of these issues. My research into this topic has revealed that a lot of schools think that issues of homelessness are not so much apparent within their school, or that may only occur in particular types of schools. The fact is that homelessness can occur to any family, and there are different types of homeless situations as well. So family homelessness, or youth running away from home. But the important thing for schools to realise is that if they understand that homelessness can occur at any age or for any child, then they're more able to identify it when it occurs early and to prevent it from happening, or to intervene to ensure that children and young people don't end up on a trajectory towards more chronic forms of homelessness. We know that young people who leave home for different reasons, sometimes it's family violence or conflict. It can also be around maltreatment issues or issues of sexual abuse or physical abuse. Other times it can be about a conflict that remains unresolved and that escalates. So there are a number of issues associated with why youth homelessness occurs. What we know from the research that we've been conducting is that the school remains the central node for these young people. They often begin with a period of couch surfing at their friends' houses, and they try and use the resources that they have within their local community, that is generally their friends and perhaps sometimes extended family as well. We also know, though, that without support, they often wear out their stays and they go into a period of, in and out of home type of living. And what can happen is that they become more and more entrenched in the transient way of living, this really does impact their ability to participate in education. What happens for many of these young people is that they will begin exhibiting different types of issues at school. It might be mental health problems. They might get into trouble for not wearing the right uniform or doing their homework, or just being extremely tired, having different behavioural issues within the school day. And so for many of these young people, school becomes quite difficult, and some may even be told to leave for various reasons. Once young people lose the anchor of school, then there is a real downward spiral into much more problematic issues. So the aim of this policy is really for schools to have some information at hand to recognise that youth homelessness exists. And it's not just an issue that occurs in later teenage years. The signs of homelessness or early homelessness can happen for very young children and in primary school. And schools need to have a plan and a policy in place to ensure that teachers know what to do when they're faced with this issue in their students. So the title is around effective school and community collaborations. So what we understand is that, youth homelessness is a very complex, multifaceted issue, and it's not an issue that schools can deal with on their own. So what schools require are strong relationships and collaborations with other services outside the school. And the best scenario is establishing those relationships early on and having them up your sleeve and in place for when the issues around student homelessness occur, so that you can know what to do to get that young person, the child, the young person support and their family support, and also to support the teachers. Sometimes, or more often than not, with the right support, children and young people can live at home. And then sometimes home is not a safe place to be, and supports can be put in place to ensure that the child or young person is provided protection and provided accommodation, with the ultimate goal of being able to effectively engage and continue in their education. So I really do recommend that all schools do have a look at this policy and ensure that you have your own policy in place for the prevention of student homelessness. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed the presentations that we've brought to you today. Just one last message from me. I hope you're able to share and distribute the resource widely. It is free, it's important, and we hope it's of value to schools. But the only way that it can be valuable to schools is if it is distributed and shared widely. So please, if you know teachers, if you know other school staff, principals, or with the particular schools that you might work with, please feel free to share it. We'll insert the link here so that you can be able to track it and share it widely. So thank you, and I wish you all the best.